Everyone advised her to adopt an orphan, saying that adopted children bring blessings to a home, blessings that would come in the form of a child of her own. But what she did not know was that she would spend the rest of her life regretting her decision. Once upon a time, in the heart of Enugu, lived a woman who everyone knew as Madame Joy. She was a businesswoman who got married to a very wealthy man. However, she was yet to have a child of her own. 15 years have passed, and Madame Joy had never for once conceived in her marriage. People whispered behind her back, saying that she traded her child for the wealth that she enjoyed. Madame Joy pretended not to be moved by their gossips. However, behind closed doors, she lived with the shame of barrenness and the fact that she had never conceived a child in her marriage, not even once. Madame Joy prayed, fasted, and even slept on mountains, hoping that God blesses her with a child. But years passed with disappointment. Doctors carried out series of tests and even subjected her to numerous treatments, but still, every pregnancy test she took returned negative. Her husband advised her to adopt a child, but Madame Joy was not receptive of the idea. She wanted a child of her own, a child who not only carried her blood, but whose roots she knew. To her, a child's lineage was not to be ignored. Madame Joy believed that certain traits and characters passed on to a child from their parents, and this made it difficult for her to accept the idea of adopting. However, years passed, and Madame Joy woke up to a cry of a baby at her gate. Her gateman rushed to her door in confusion, informing her that a baby had been abandoned at the gate. Wrapped in a pink blanket, the child cried, as though heaven itself was announcing her arrival. At first, Madame Joy hesitated. She looked at the baby with suspicion, wondering who could have abandoned her there and why. She remembered the advice of her friends who told her that adopting a child would open her womb and bring blessings to her life. Madame Joy saw this as a sign. She decided to adopt the child to care for her like her own. She named her Anwuli, and for the first time in years, she felt a love that she never knew existed. She bathed her, fed her, and loved her as though she had come from her own womb. 5 years passed, and Anwuli grew into a very beautiful girl. Not only was she beautiful, she was so brilliant and outspoken. Her teachers praised her, neighbors adored her, and even her father complimented her boldness. Madame Joy loved Anwuli with all of her heart. She dressed her in the finest clothes, sent her to the best schools, and proudly referred to her as her daughter. Anwuli was the light of her home, the one who wiped the shame away from her face. Only people who were close to the family knew that she was not their biological daughter. She blended so well into the family that many commented on how she looked so much like Madame Joy. One evening, whilst they were having dinner, Anwuli told her mother that the baby was in her womb. Madame Joy looked at her confused, wondering what she was talking about. She brushed off the conversation as being unserious and carried on with her activities as normal. However, days later, she fell sick and decided to visit her doctor, who broke the news to her that she was pregnant. This was the first time ever, and Madame Joy could not believe her ears. It was like a dream, one she had waited her entire life to see. Madame Joy rushed home with tears in her eyes, shouting the news to her husband and even lifting little Anwuli in her arms. "My daughter, your prophecy has come true. You said there was a baby in my womb, and indeed, there is," she said to Anwuli, who giggled in excitement. Her pregnancy was so smooth and easy, and by 9 months, she gave birth to a bouncing baby boy. Madame Joy, for the first time, held her own baby in her arms. Tears poured down her eyes as she thanked God for answering her prayers. People who once mocked her began to envy her as Madame Joy showered her son with so much love. Chidubem became her pride and treasure. She pampered him endlessly, doted on him, and sang his praises to anyone that cared to listen. However, something inside her shifted the day her friend drew her attention to the fact that Anwuli could one day rise to displace her son. "Remember, she's not your daughter. You have to put your legs down and put her in her place before she rises up one day to claim all that you have to herself," she said to Madame Anwuli, who who could not help but agree. She began to treat Anwuli with disdain, withdrew the love that she once showered on her, showing her nothing but hate. The child, who she once called her joy, became a shadow. Her affection for Anwuli began to fade. She scolded her harshly for small mistakes, withheld hugs that she once freely gave, and reminded her at every turn that she was not her real child. Anwuli's laughter dimmed. The little girl who once ran into her mother's arms with bright smiles now sat quietly in corners, her spirit wounded by rejection. Anwuli grew up under the sting of neglect. Her smiles faded, and the love she once enjoyed was snatched away like a garment from her shoulders. The house that once echoed with her laughter now carried her silence like a heavy shadow. Madame Joy poured everything into her son Chidubem, whilst Anwuli became invisible in her own home. She was given the leftovers, the smaller gifts, the colder words. Whenever she tried to ask, "Mama, what did I do wrong?" Madame Joy's heart would harden even more, and she would reply, "You are not my real child. Don't forget that." Still, Anwuli carried no bitterness. Though her heart bled, she continued to love her mother. She studied hard, excelled in school, and still greeted her mother every morning with a smile, hoping for a little warmth in return. Years rolled by, and Anwuli blossomed into a graceful young woman. She was admired everywhere she went, and people saw Madame Joy as lucky for having a daughter like her. But what Madame Joy did not know was that the child she adopted was not just any orphan. She was the very child who would one day expose the cracks in her heart and ruin her peace. One afternoon, Anwuli returned home from school, her books pressed tightly to her chest. As she walked in, she heard loud shouting from the living room. Curious, she dropped her bag and walked closer. There, she found her younger brother Chidubem, screaming at his nanny. His tiny fist slammed the chair as he yelled, "You are my servant! Do what I say!" The nanny, a gentle woman in her 30s, stood in tears, unable to defend herself. Anwuli's heart bored. Though she had been mistreated, she could not stand to see injustice, not even from her little brother. She stepped forward, her voice firm but calm. "Chidubem, this is wrong. You must never disrespect adults, especially those who care for you. Apologize to her now." Her words, though spoken in love, pierced the boy's pride. Chidubem burst into loud tears, crying so bitterly that his voice echoed through the house. And it was in that very moment that Madame Joy walked in. She saw her beloved son, crying and pointing at Anwuli, who was standing next to him. Madame Joy did not ask questions. She didn't seek the truth. With a swift movement, she raised a hand and struck Anwuli hard across the face. The sound of the slap cracked through the air like thunder as Anwuli froze, her hand trembling as her eyes opened wide in shock. "How dare you correct my son?" Madame Joy shouted. "Who gave you the right to touch my son?" "Mother, Chidubem was disrespecting the nanny," she said to Madame Joy, who rebuked her in anger. "You are not even my daughter. Why are you still calling me mother? From today, I rebuke you from ever referring to me as your mother. I only have one child, and that's Chidubem here, who you will accord some respect." The words sliced through Anwuli's heart like a knife. She stood back and watched as Madame Joy stripped her of the little privilege that she had left. Her fine clothes were all taken away, replaced with a maid's uniform. The comfortable room that she once occupied was taken away from her, replaced with a mat. Madame Joy even stopped her from going to school, saying that Anwuli had no right to attend the same school as her son. Anwuli became a maid in her own house. She cooked, cleaned and did the laundry. The other maids in the house could not hide their shock. They could not understand why Madame Joy suddenly turned her back on her adopted daughter. A girl who she once loved and called her own had now become a maid to a woman who she once called mother. Madame Joy spoke to her husband about sending her away, but her husband kicked against the idea. "That's our daughter we are talking about," Chief said to her as he reminded her of the days when she did not have a child. "You once took this girl in as your own daughter. What changed now?" he asked Madame Joy, who said that she had to put Anwuli in her place before she starts dragging properties with her own son. Chief sighed deeply. his eyes fixed on his wife. Joy, Awuli will never do that. After all, that's why we have wills. She won't claim anything that isn't given to her. I promise you that. Those words calmed Madam Joy a little. She finally agreed to allow Awuli stay in the house. From that day forward, Awuli lived under the roof as nothing more than a maid. She swept the floors, washed the dishes, polished the cars and carried laundry on her delicate shoulders. Whilst Chidubem grew fat with indulgence, he mocked her mercilessly, calling her the house girl, and laughed whenever his friends came around and saw her scrubbing the floor. One afternoon, as Amuli walked past Chidubem, he smacked her bum and began to laugh. The sting burned, but what hurt more were his words. "It's not even soft," he said to Amuli, who bawled in anger. Chidubem was only 10, but his tongue was sharper than an adult. He went on to call Anwuli a glorified house help, and Anwuli could not hold back her tears. She tried to speak to him calmly, but Chidubem began to yell angrily at the top of his voice. Madam Joy, who had been walking down the corridor, overheard everything that happened. Instead of rebuking her son, her face twisted in rage as she shouted at Anwuli, who tried to explain what had happened. But Madam Joy was not having it. "He touched your bum and so what? Is that why you're speaking to him like that? You think you're better than him, right?" she said to Anwuli, who she told to kneel down and apologize to her son. Anwuli's knees grew weak. Her tears streamed down freely as she tried to explain to Madam Joy that she did nothing wrong. "I only asked him not to speak to me that way," she said to Madam Joy, who gave her a very hot slap across her face. The sound echoed through the corridor like a whip. "From this day, I forbid you from ever standing before my son or raising your voice in this house. You are nothing before him. Nothing. Now, go down on your knees and beg him," she said to Anwuli, as Chidubem, emboldened by his mother's support, folded his arms and smirked at Anwuli. He enjoyed the power he held over her. Power given to him by the very woman who once called Anwuli her joy. Anwuli shook her head in disbelief. She could not recognize the woman before her. The same woman who had once cradled her, kissed her forehead, and called her a miracle. Now she was being treated as less than a servant, and Anwuli did not know what she did to deserve such kind of hatred. She was happy to have a brother, not knowing that the same brother would one day turn on her. She went down on her knees and apologized to Chidubem, who smirked proudly, his small chest puffed up with arrogance. Madam Joy, satisfied with her daughter's humiliation, turned away coldly, her words cutting through Anwuli's soul like a blade. "From today, never forget your place. You are not my child and would never be. In fact, pack your things and leave my house. I give you 2 hours," she said to Anwuli, who pleaded for her mercy. But Madam Joy's mind was already made up. She went to the storeroom to pack her bags, when suddenly she heard a loud scream. Anwuli rushed out of the store in panic. She met Madam Joy, who was crying and staring at the television screen. A plane had just crashed and Chief happened to be on the same flight. He had a business meeting in Abuja and left the house a few hours ago to catch his flight. Anwuli froze. She could not believe her ears. Chief, the only one who had ever defended her, was now gone. Madam Joy collapsed onto the floor, her hands clutching her chest as she wailed bitterly. The maids rushed in, their cries filling the room, but Anwuli stood still, her body numb with shock. Hours later, a man in a dark suit arrived at the mansion. He introduced himself as Chief's lawyer. As he began to speak, Chief gave me an instruction that upon his demise, his will be read immediately in the presence of his immediate family, including Miss Anwuli. Madam Joy could not hide her anger. "What has Anwuli got to do with this? She's not our daughter, so why will my husband include her in his will?" she asked the lawyer, who stared at her for a moment and began to read. "I, Chief Obina, being of sound mind, do hereby state that upon my death, all of my wealth, my companies, estates, lands, and accounts shall be given to Anwuli's grandmother, the only woman who I have truly loved. She is to share the property as she deems fit amongst Anwuli and my immediate family." Madam Joy's mouth fell open. This must be a mistake. My husband, in love with another woman? Is Anwuli his granddaughter? How did all this happen under my roof? She asked the lawyer, who shook his head, revealing that their house and everything she owned now belonged to Anwuli's grandmother. Madame Joy froze in disbelief. Her hands trembled violently as she cried, "No, no, this can't be. Anwuli and her useless grandmother have bewitched him. You witch!" she screamed, turning towards Anwuli, who she accused of bewitching her husband and killing him. The lawyer sighed and handed Madame Joy a sealed envelope. "Chief instructed me to give you this. Inside, you will find an address. He said all your answers lie there." With fury burning in her veins, Madame Joy grabbed the envelope and stormed out of the house, determined to uncover the truth. Hours later, she arrived at the address. It was a small house on the outskirts of town. As she stepped inside, her eyes fell on a young woman who looked so much like Anwuli. "Who are you?" Madame Joy demanded, as her voice trembled. The young woman stood tall as she revealed to her that she was Anwuli's mother. "How dare you and your useless mother try to ruin my life? You all killed my husband and forced him to leave everything that he has to you wretched lots. I need to see your mother now, to look her in the eye and inform her that her evil plans have failed." Tears filled Anwuli's mother's eyes as she remained calm. She watched as Madame Joy poured out her frustration, threatening to kill them all if they tried to stand in her way. As she was about leaving, Anwuli's mother said something that shocked her to the bones. She revealed that Anwuli's grandmother that she was looking for was standing right there with her. Madame Joy stood there frozen as Anwuli's mother pointed directly at her and called her mother. Madame Joy staggered backwards, her body trembling as she asked her what she meant. "What did you just say?" she asked Anwuli's mother, who revealed that she was her daughter, the child she abandoned in an orphanage so many years ago. Madame Joy could not believe her ears. Years ago, she got pregnant for a man who denied the pregnancy and left her with no form of help. She toiled for the whole 9 months and finally gave birth to a beautiful baby girl who she abandoned at the orphanage. For all these years, she never knew that her daughter was looking for her. One day, she went to a salon to make her hair. When the young woman who was making her hair saw a similar white patch on her head that she also had on her own hair, she took her name and picture and showed it to the oldest woman at the orphanage, who told her years ago that she met her mother on the day that she was abandoned. The woman took a good look at the photograph and informed her that Madame Joy was her mother. The woman could not mistake the face, as Madame Joy looked so much like her dead sister. Madame Joy shook as the truth unraveled before her eyes. Anwuli's mother was not just a stranger, she was her own daughter. She stood there stunned as Anwuli's mother narrated how she searched for years and found her by coincidence at the salon. "I discovered you are wealthy, living in a mansion, and yet unable to have a child again. So I decided to give you my child, your own granddaughter, to care for." Madame Joy gasped, her knees buckling as she grabbed a chair to steady herself. Anwuli was not just an orphan, she was her own granddaughter, the child who she had so despised. Anwuli's mother narrated how she got pregnant for the man that she loved. They were planning their wedding when suddenly he died in a car accident. She was left alone, pregnant with no family or money. She knew she could not raise Anwuli by herself. So she decided to leave her by her mother's gate, hoping that her mother would take her in and treat her like her own. "I believed it was destiny, that you would give her the life that I never could. I prayed that you would not send her away, and for a while you loved her, but then you cast her aside, just as you cast me aside years ago." Tears poured down Madame Joy's eyes as the guilt she had buried years ago came back with the force of a storm. She could not believe that her husband knew of the secret that she kept hidden for all these years. Anwuli's mother met him years back and introduced herself to him as his wife's daughter. She pleaded with him not to tell her mother about her existence. All that she wanted was for Anwuli to be well cared for, and Chief promised to give her the best. That was